The rain hammered against the windows of the downtown Chicago bar as Victoria Monroe scrolled through her phone, oblivious to the danger that had begun to circle her like a predator. 3 years had passed since she'd left that world, the world of money, power, and blood. 3 years since Marcus Valentino had made it clear she would never be enough for a man like him. She was just a distraction, he'd said coldly, a beautiful mistake. She'd built a new life since then, working as an interior designer, keeping to herself, trying to forget the intensity of his dark eyes and the way his touch had made her feel both safe and terrified, all at once. Victoria had no idea that her past was about to collide with her present in the most dangerous way possible. The bar's back door burst open with a violent crash. 3 men in dark suits stormed in, their faces cold and predatory. They weren't looking for a drink. They were looking for her. Victoria's heart stopped as she recognized one of them, Dmitry Volkov, a ruthless Russian gangster who'd been threatening her father's business before she'd disappeared. He'd made it clear that he wanted her, not because he loved her, but because possessing Marcus Valentino's former lover would cement his power over the Chicago underworld. Victoria stood up, her legs shaking, preparing to run. But before she could move, the front entrance exploded with activity. Black-clad security personnel flooded in, moving with military precision. And there, at the center of the chaos, was Marcus. He moved like a predator through the turmoil, his sharp features harder than she remembered, his eyes colder and darker. He was a man who'd aged into his power in those 3 years, more dangerous, more lethal, more impossibly beautiful. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and Victoria saw something flash across his face. Recognition, fury, something that might have been concern. Marcus didn't hesitate. He moved toward Dmitry with a violence so calculated and cold that it made Victoria's blood turn to ice. Within seconds, the Russian mobster and his men were on the ground, disarmed and defeated. It was over almost as quickly as it had begun. Marcus turned to face Victoria, his breathing controlled despite the intensity of the fight. She could see the power radiating from him, the absolute authority he commanded in this world. He was the boss now. She could see it in the way his men positioned themselves around him, in the way they awaited his orders. "Get her secured," he commanded, his voice devoid of emotion. "Now." As his security team moved toward her, Victoria realized that her carefully constructed new life was about to be shattered forever. Marcus Valentino had found her, and this time he had no intention of letting her go. The penthouse was a fortress of glass and steel, perched on the 42nd floor of one of Chicago's most exclusive towers. It was beautiful in a cold, controlled way, much like the man who owned it. Victoria stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city lights below, and tried to process what had happened. She was trapped, not in a literal prison, but the effect was the same. Marcus had brought her here after the incident at the bar, and despite her protests, he refused to let her leave. "This is kidnapping," she'd said, her voice shaking with anger and something else, something she refused to name. "This is protection," Marcus had replied calmly, his dark eyes studying her with an intensity that made her feel exposed. "Dmitry wants you dead, or worse. I won't let that happen." Now, hours later, Victoria still didn't understand why he cared. He'd made it clear 3 years ago that she meant nothing to him, yet here he was, keeping her locked away in his penthouse, assigning guards to watch her constantly. The contradiction was driving her insane. She heard footsteps behind her and didn't need to turn around to know it was Marcus. She could feel his presence like a physical force. "You should rest," he said, his voice carrying the weight of command. "It's been a long night." Victoria turned to face him, and her breath caught. He'd changed out of the suit he'd worn during the fight. Now he wore dark jeans and a black shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing the intricate tattoos that marked him as a man of his world. He looked simultaneously more dangerous and somehow more human than before. "I want to go home," she said, hating the way her voice wavered. "I want my life back." Marcus moved closer, and Victoria fought the urge to step away. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of knowing how much he still affected her. "Your life is no longer safe," he said quietly. "Dmitri was just the beginning. There are others who know about our connection. They'll use you to get to me. Here, in this penthouse, you're untouchable. I've made sure of it." "By locking me away like some kind of prisoner," Victoria snapped, anger rising to mask the fear underneath. "By keeping you alive," Marcus countered, and there was something in his tone, something raw and real that made her pause. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch gentle and impossibly tender for a man who'd spent the evening committing violence. "I know I have no right to protect you after what I said before, but I'm doing it anyway. Accept it, Victoria. Accept that you're mine to protect now, not because I own you, but because I won't lose you twice." His words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Victoria wanted to argue, wanted to deny the significance of what he was saying, but the truth was, standing in his penthouse, surrounded by his security, looking into his eyes, she realized that despite everything, despite the 3 years apart, despite the rejection that had nearly broken her, she was right where part of her had always wanted to be. She was right where she'd never thought she could be again, back in Marcus Valentino's world, and inexplicably at the center of his focus. 3 weeks passed in the penthouse. Victoria had stopped asking to leave after the first week, not because she'd given up, but because she'd begun to see the complexity beneath Marcus's ruthless exterior. Each day he would emerge from his office late in the afternoon, and together they would talk about everything except the elephant in the room, their past. He told her about his ascent to power, about the weight of running an empire built on both legal and illegal operations. She learned that he'd expanded the family business into technology and real estate, using his criminal connections as a foundation for legitimate enterprises that had made him richer and more untouchable than ever. She listened to the careful way he explained his decisions, the moral calculations he made every single day to survive in a world where one mistake could cost him everything. In return, Victoria shared her own journey, how she'd tried to build a normal life, how empty it had felt without the intensity of his world. She'd told him about her design business, about the apartment she'd rented, about the loneliness that had followed her like a shadow despite her efforts to move on. One evening, as they sat on the terrace overlooking the city, Marcus produced a bottle of vintage wine and 2 glasses. The Chicago skyline was alive with lights, and the air carried the scent of spring rain. Victoria watched as he poured, noting the confident, practiced way he moved. Everything he did had precision and purpose. "I need to tell you something," he said, and Victoria felt her stomach tighten at his tone. She'd learned to recognize when he was about to say something difficult. Dmitri wasn't working alone. There's a rival family, the Sanchez organization. They're moving into Chicago. They see me as an obstacle, and they know that if they can control you, they can control me. It's worse than I initially told you. Victoria's throat went dry. "What does that mean?" "It means you need to stay here longer," Marcus said, meeting her eyes. "It means you're in real danger. And it means—" He paused, and she saw something vulnerable flicker across his face, something raw and honest. "It means I can't let you go. Not until it's safe. Not until they understand that touching you means starting a war they can't win." "That's not love, Marcus," Victoria whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "That's possession. That's what you accused yourself of being 3 years ago, and it's why you sent me away." Marcus was silent for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand, his grip firm and warm. "You're right. 3 years ago I was terrified. I realized I was becoming obsessed with you, and I told myself it was weakness. I told myself that a man like me couldn't have someone like you, that you deserved better than to be entangled in my world." He turned her hand over, tracing the lines of her palm. "But I was wrong. The real weakness wasn't loving you. It was letting you go. And I won't make that mistake again. Victoria felt tears prick her eyes. You're still trying to control this. Control me. That's not what I want. I know, Marcus said softly, and I'm trying to change. But Victoria, I need you to understand something. In my world, protection and possession are often the same thing. Letting you leave means risking your life, and I won't do that. I can't. The attack came at dawn, which was fitting somehow. The Sanchez organization had finally made their move, and Victoria woke to the sound of gunfire echoing through the penthouse. Sharp, terrible sounds that shattered the illusion of safety Marcus had built around her. She heard shouting, the thunder of boots on marble floors, and her heart hammered against her ribs as adrenaline flooded her system. For 3 weeks, she'd existed in a bubble of safety, watching Marcus operate in his world, understanding the complexity of the man she'd once thought so simple. Now, that world was collapsing around her. The penthouse door burst open, and Marcus appeared, dressed all in black, a gun holstered at his side. His face was all hard lines and cold fury. His dark eyes, usually so controlled, blazed with an intensity that both terrified and thrilled her. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice brooking no argument. "Don't move until I come back for you. Lock the door, hide in the panic room if you need to. But Victoria, you stay alive. That's the only order of mine you need to follow today." "Marcus, wait!" Victoria started reaching for him, but he was already gone, disappearing back into the chaos. She heard the door slam, heard the lock engage, heard the terrible sounds of violence resuming in the distance. She couldn't obey. The need to move, to do something, to be more than a helpless observer consumed her. Driven by instinct and something deeper, a need to see him alive, to know he was winning, Victoria crept out of the bedroom and toward the office where she could see tactical screens displaying security feeds. What she saw made her blood run cold and her mind race. The penthouse was under siege. 6 tactical teams had breached the lower levels, and despite Marcus's overwhelming security force, men trained and equipped to handle exactly this kind of assault, the attackers were gaining ground with calculated precision. They moved like a coordinated military unit, not like the disorganized criminals she might have expected. Someone had trained them well, someone with resources and connections as deep as Marcus's own. Victoria's eyes scanned the security feeds, tracking the firefight as it moved through the building. She could see Marcus's people holding the elevator banks, creating a defensive perimeter on the 35th floor. But the attackers were systematic, using the building's architecture against them, cutting off escape routes, forcing Marcus's men into increasingly isolated positions. The math was brutal. Without intervention, Marcus would be overrun within minutes. Her mind raced, understanding what Marcus had been trying to tell her all along. In his world, there were no safe choices, only choices that led to different kinds of danger. She could stay hidden and hope the penthouse held, or she could do something to shift the balance of power. She could remain passive, or she could become active. She could be a victim of circumstance, or she could be a partner. Victoria moved to Marcus's desk with purpose, her fingers trembling with adrenaline as she accessed the files she'd seen him reviewing during those long afternoons when they'd talked. She'd watched him work, watched the way he analyzed problems, understood the architecture of his operations. There it was, the file labeled Sanchez Financial Architecture. Inside were the digital blueprints of everything they'd built, accounts, money trails, and most importantly, the encryption key that the family's cybersecurity team had discovered 3 days ago during their intelligence gathering. There was a vulnerability in their system, a back door that had been accidentally left open during a system upgrade. The Sanchez organization's financial infrastructure was, in essence, a house of cards held together by outdated security protocols. Victoria understood networks the way a musician understands a symphony. She could see the patterns, the flow of information, the pressure points where a small push could create a cascade. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, muscle memory from her years as a designer, translating to the rhythm of code execution. She'd learned more about security systems in 3 weeks around Marcus than she'd ever thought possible, simply by listening, by observing, by being interested in his world. She accessed the secure communication channels that Marcus's team had set up, routed through encrypted servers that would be impossible to trace back to this location. She sent the message with a prayer, coordinates, timestamps, and the access code that would allow Marcus's cybersecurity division to execute a coordinated financial attack on the Sanchez organization. She sent it to his head of security with a note. Now, every account, every transaction, freeze everything. Then she sent a second message, this one to Marcus directly. It's done. All their money is frozen. Their system is collapsing. They'll know they're being dismantled in seconds. Move now. Within 90 seconds, she watched the clock. She heard the shift. The gunfire became sporadic as Marcus's security team, no longer fighting defensively, began moving forward with renewed momentum. The tactical feeds showed a change in the battle's dynamics. The Sanchez team, coordinated and disciplined until now, began to fragment as communications broke down. Someone on their end was screaming orders that weren't being received. Their coordination collapsed like a house made of sand under the rising tide. She heard Marcus's voice through the communication system, giving orders with the precision of a general leading a coup. Breach northeast corridor. Cut off their retreat. Teams 4 and 6 move to secure the stairwell. They came in through the service entrance on level 23. We push down and lock it down. Nobody leaves this building until they're all secured. The gunfire became sporadic, then ceased entirely. The silence that followed was almost worse than the violence had been. It meant something had shifted. It meant the battle was ending, but she didn't know who had won. Victoria stood frozen, staring at the tactical screens, watching as blue dots, Marcus's men, surrounded red dots, the attackers, and watched as the red dots went still one by one. She heard Marcus's voice again, cutting through the comm system. Casualties? 3 dead, 7 wounded. We'll stabilize them, came the response from someone Victoria didn't recognize. And them? 8 in custody, 2 dead in the corridor firefight. They didn't surrender, sir. They came in knowing they probably wouldn't leave. Marcus was silent for a moment. Then, who authorized this? Who's running this operation? I want answers within the hour. Another pause. Then his voice changed, softened. And someone tell me Victoria is safe. She's secure in the penthouse office, his head of security reported, and Victoria realized they must have had surveillance she wasn't aware of. Of course they did. Marcus would never leave anything to chance. Keep her there until I come get her personally. When he burst back into the office, she expected anger. She expected fury that she'd disobeyed his direct order to stay hidden. Instead, Marcus moved like a man possessed, and before she could even speak, he pulled her into his arms with such force that it knocked the breath from her body. He held her so tightly she could barely breathe, and she heard the slight tremor in his voice that betrayed just how close he'd come to losing it all. You incredible, reckless woman, he breathed into her hair, his words part prayer, part curse. You could have died. If anyone had known you were here, if anyone had found you, so could you, Victoria said, pulling back to look at his face. There was a cut along his left temple, dripping blood, and her heart clenched at the sight of it. She reached up and carefully touched the wound. And I couldn't accept that possibility. Not anymore. I understand now. It's not about control for you. It's about refusing to lose someone you love. And Marcus, I'm not willing to lose you either. I was scared to face that before, but I'm not scared anymore. He caught her wrist gently, pressing her palm against his chest where she could feel his heart racing. What did you do? I froze their money, she said simply. All of it. Their entire financial infrastructure collapsed in seconds. Your team was able to move forward because they lost their advantage. I understand networks and systems. I understand how information flows. I used that. Marcus was silent for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her face, as if trying to understand how she'd transformed from the woman he'd rejected 3 years ago into this. A partner, an equal, someone willing to fight in her own way. "I love you," he said quietly. "I've loved you since the moment I met you, and I've never stopped. But I've been trying to protect you by controlling you, and I was wrong. I see that now. What you did today, you didn't do it because I told you to or because I forced you to. You did it because you chose to, because you wanted to fight alongside me, not against me." He kissed her then, fierce and desperate and full of all the emotion he'd been restraining since the moment she'd walked back into his life. It was a kiss that tasted like promises and apologies, and the beginning of something entirely new. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I'm changing everything," he said, the words carrying the weight of a vow. "The way I've been doing business, the way I've been operating. I want you in this life, Victoria, but not as a possession or a captive. As my partner, my equal. I'm going to restructure everything so that you have a real voice in our operations." "I believe you," she whispered, "and I want that too." In the days and weeks that followed, everything shifted. The immediate threat from the Sanchez organization was neutralized. Their financial infrastructure took months to rebuild, and by then, Marcus's organization had already absorbed their territory and their operations. But the real change came in Marcus himself. He brought Victoria into his world fully and completely. She moved from being his hidden secret to being his public partner. She helped him design legitimate business fronts, restructured his real estate operations with an eye toward creating sustainable wealth that didn't depend on criminal enterprise. She brought her creative vision into his corporate offices, designed the architecture of his legitimate technology businesses, and slowly transformed what had been a relationship born of darkness into something built on genuine partnership and trust. Marcus introduced her to his inner circle, not just as a girlfriend or a possession, but as a strategic partner. She sat in on meetings, offered her perspective on business decisions, and was actually listened to. For the first time in his life, Marcus was building something that wasn't based on fear or loyalty born of violence, but on genuine collaboration. 3 months after the attack, Victoria sat in the same penthouse overlooking Chicago, but everything had changed. Marcus was beside her, his arm around her waist, his hand resting on her hip, with a possessiveness that no longer felt suffocating, but instead felt like a promise. They were planning their future together. Not the future he'd demanded 3 years ago when he'd rejected her, and not the future she'd run away into, but something entirely new. Something built on truth and choice, and a love so fierce it had survived betrayal and time and distance. "No regrets?" Marcus asked, his dark eyes studying hers with that intensity she'd come to crave. "About any of this? About choosing me, about choosing this life?" Victoria turned to face him fully, and she saw the vulnerability underneath his controlled exterior. He was asking because he needed to know, because for the first time in his life he wasn't confident about something outside his control. He was asking because he loved her, truly loved her, and that love terrified him in ways that violence and danger never could. "None," she said firmly. "Not anymore. I choose this. I choose you. Not because I'm trapped, not because I'm afraid of the alternative, but because this is where I want to be. You're where I want to be." She reached up and touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw. "I love you, Marcus Valentino. I've loved you since the beginning, even when I was running, even when I was trying to hate you for sending me away." Marcus pulled her close, and as the Chicago lights twinkled beneath them like fallen stars, he kissed her with a tenderness that stood in stark contrast to the violence he'd committed to protect her. And Victoria knew that sometimes the most dangerous choice was also the most beautiful one. Sometimes the person who saved you was also the person who could destroy you. Sometimes that was exactly the kind of love worth fighting for. Sometimes the greatest risks yielded the greatest rewards. The city spread out before them like a kingdom they would rule together, not through fear alone, but through partnership, strategy, and a love that had been tested and proven unbreakable. Victoria leaned into Marcus's embrace, and as she looked out at their Chicago, she understood that she'd finally found where she belonged. Not in running, not in hiding, but in the arms of the man she'd never been able to forget.